As you apply keto principles, depending on the amount of carb restriction you have, you can get into this issue of having higher and higher LDL cholesterol. So his idea was to kind of tag on to what you did, and that is if this is driven by a physiology in which you have depleted glucose stores and glycogen from the liver, you're a lean individual, and your LDL cholesterol has gone up in a way due to the lipid energy model, for example. Could it be the case that adding carbohydrates back to the diet would basically reverse this process, which resulted in very high LDL? So if it's a carbohydrate refeeding that's responsible for the drop in LDL, does it matter what carbohydrate you have? Does it have to be a certain type of carb? Does it have to be a grain? Does it have to be a processed carb? And so what I thought Nick did that was very interesting, he said, well, let's pick a carb that people wouldn't think is very healthy. Now, there could be a lot of things on that list, but he chose Oreo cookies, right? So nobody would look at Oreo cookies as a health food, and nobody would look at it as something you would intervene with in somebody's physiology. And yet, if the idea is that a carb is a carb, and if I introduce carbs sufficiently back into a system that is awry because it's having to transport lots of fat to burn energy, right? So this was the idea. Let me, in his words, let's go on a ketogenic diet, stable baseline, usual activity, everything as it normally is, but with an LDL cholesterol that's quite high, in excess of 350. And let's, in that setting, introduce Oreo cookies, 100 grams of glucose a day in the form of Oreo cookies, and see what happens to LDL cholesterol. And then after that has happened for a period of time, stop that experiment, wash out, go back to your baseline everything. And then with LDL cholesterol back to a high baseline, try statin therapy to see what effect statins would have in lowering LDL, as that is one of our most common means by which we treat patients. And not just any old statin, rosuvastatin 20 milligrams will be considered a high intensity statin. And since it takes 6 weeks or so for that to become steady state, check this regularly over a period of time to see what the nadir is for the LDL cholesterol on the statin. So that's the experiment. The experiment is to take a case study of somebody who is a known lean mass hyperresponder, who has a baseline LDL cholesterol that's quite high, introduce carbs, see what the effect is, wash out. Then once you're back to baseline, treat with statins for a period of 6 weeks and see what happens. The experiment was fascinating because just as you showed that carb introduction in the setting of a lean mass hyperresponsive phenotype can rapidly decrease LDL, over a 14-day period of time, there was a 71% reduction in mixed LDL cholesterol. And it wasn't something that took a while to see. I mean, he had several different labs performed during that period of time, and it came down smartly. At 14 days, the question was, is this real? And he even checked it again at 15 and 16 days to ensure that this was a real phenomenology. It wasn't just a lab quirk. And so just as you had seen in your experiment, he saw in his experiment that carbohydrate reintroduction can robustly and rapidly reduce LDL cholesterol, in his case by 71%. Now, what happened with the statin? Now, you would expect 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin to give a 45 to 50% reduction in LDL cholesterol. Now, everybody's different, but there's a lot of literature out there where you can have an expected response. In Nick's case, it went down about 30%. And so you can take away from that a couple of things. Number one, statins did reduce LDL cholesterol, but not by the magnitude that you saw with carbohydrate reintroduction. Carbohydrate reintroduction was more than twice as robust at lowering the LDL cholesterol, and in a relatively, a very short period of time, 14 days. And secondly, you can look at that 30% reduction in LDL cholesterol and say, is there more to the story, right? Is there a reason that it wasn't 45 or 50% as might be expected just based on population data? There's an element to this we've called lean mass hyperresponder. And although the phenotype doesn't have a criterion for leanness in it, we know from a variety of data that the leaner the individual, the greater the LDL cholesterol excursion in most cases. And so there clearly is a linkage between leanness in the context of a ketogenic diet, low carb diet, and the magnitude of LDL increase that might occur. And so this kind of goes back to some underlying principles of what may be going on physiologically and why I think the lipid energy model has a lot to contribute to the conversation. So if you're talking about somebody who's pretty lean, let's say a BMI well below 25, even below 20, right? Somebody who's working out a lot, whose overall physiology is such that they are challenged to store a lot of carbs, challenged to store a lot of glycogen. These are folks who have, really, gone to a type of physiology that many people don't see that often. I mean, the type of people we see in our clinic are more insulin resistant, centrally obese. So they're the antithesis of this. So how many times we actually get to see folks who, by virtue of their diet and lifestyle, have attained and maintained a very lean and healthy phenotype, and at the same time have chosen for various reasons to be on a ketogenic diet that is, in many cases, pretty restrictive in carbohydrates, well less than 30 grams a day. Okay, so now we have set up a unique experiment in a unique population that at least I had not come in contact with that much in my clinical practice. You just don't see these people as a clinician that often, right? So as a result, you have to kind of change your mindset into thinking, what would it look like for somebody to be that person and still be able to meet all their energy needs physiologically, not just for day-to-day activities, but for those who are physically active as well. And the idea of fat adaptation is one in which you're basically changing your energy substrate primarily from glucose to fatty acids. All right, well, that makes sense where the fatty acids coming from. And this is where, things get kind of interesting as well. We typically have lots and lots of calories stored in adipose tissue. And most of us have many, many days of reserve, more than we need at any moment in time. But what if you are in this lean adapted state and you are now burning energy in a way that as you are consuming fat, it's got to be trafficked such that it's contributing to lots of your energy demands, not to your storage demands. Right now, when we're trying to store, we're trying to burn. Now, that's a different model. And we have some things in lipidology that kind of mimic that. But at the same time, the question is, if we are really hard, using those energies that we're consuming immediately, we need them. We need them now. I don't have a lot of reserve to tap into. Then that's going to require the body to do things physiologically in a different way, where we're going to have to traffic these things so they're not just available, but they're driving our energy, right? And so I think these are the nuances in the lipid energy model that, while we're still trying to find ways to test some of the steps to make sure that if we can get them, very detailed radio tagged lipoprotein turnover information, which would be great to have. In the absence of that, it's cogent to think that if I'm driving my energy needs through export of VLDL and triglycerides from the liver, and I'm able to quickly take the triglyceride out with lipoprotein lipase and quickly use that energy as the body needs, then would that be a switch that could turn off quickly if I simply change the substrate to having lots of carbs now? Now I have a lot of carbs available. I didn't have that before, but now I do. And part of that is going to be, well, I can burn it, but part of that's also going to be that I can replete stores that would be depleted. And if I'm repleting stores, then will there be the same need for me to massively increase my VLDL production and export to fuel my energy needs? Maybe not. All right, well, if this is a toggle, how quickly can this toggle come on and come off? In your case, it was over a matter of 7 days. In Nick's case, similarly, in a very short period of time, the body is adapting. And if you think about it, that shouldn't surprise us so much. We find ourselves physiologically needing to adapt very quickly to various situations. What happens if you're in a plane crash and you're stranded somewhere and you don't have food available. Your body has to adapt to use its energy stores, so that you can make it till you find a meal. We take kind of a long view of things. We have our pathways, and VLDL is a triglyceride-rich particle that comes out of the liver. It gets acted on by lipoprotein lipase. The triglyceride is hydrolyzed and used for energy. The particle shrinks in size into an LDL class particle, which is then subsequently cleared. And that's kind of what we all know. Working around the edges of that, though, is the idea, well, how rapidly can you increase VLDL production? And how rapidly can you increase lipoprotein lipase activity? And if you could increase lipoprotein lipase activity a lot, could you rapidly deplete VLDL particles in such a way that you're now left with a boatload of LDL particles in a faster time frame than you would have expected, and now your body has to do something with it? And that something's called clearance. So how do we clear LDL particles? Through LDL receptors. An LDL receptor binds a particle, pulls it out of the blood, goes back and does it again. That's the process. Well, can you overwhelm that process? Can you have so many particles that these receptors aren't keeping up? Yes, you can do that. But the common model we have is that the receptor gets injured or is in some way not functional as it should be, and we end up clearing poorly. So the model we have in our working lexicon is FH, where people have an LDL receptor axis disorder of any number of types, 2,000 different defects and counting. And at the end of the day, I just can't bind and clear particles very well. So my problem is a lack of sufficiently functional LDL receptors in a number that could keep up with my needs. So that's what we think of as LDL receptors that either don't work well, low in number, or both. Well, that's not this. This is something else. This is lots of LDL particles. We haven't necessarily done anything to the LDL receptor. And left to our imagination is, well, what else could be going on that might influence LDL levels outside of just VLDL? And this gets into a lot of what ifs that I don't have the data for, but just what ifs. What if in the process of taking lots of energy in the form of fats into our cells, we were to downregulate LDL receptors? There is a little bit of data for that with saturated fat, but not for necessarily total fat or others. But there are models out there where you can downregulate LDL receptors in certain ways. Okay, so maybe that's downregulated. Maybe we're increasing cholesterol absorption from our gut. We're a hyperabsorber. And because we're absorbing many more sterols, we are overwhelming basically the ability of the system to maintain an adequate LDL response, because we know that if we decrease cholesterol absorption, we increase the number of LDL receptors. The converse is, if I increase lots of absorption, I can downregulate LDL receptors. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just my LDL receptors, unless somebody comes along to give me a hand, are not going to keep up because we're just overwhelming them with substrate and VLDL-derived LDL particles. All of these are possibilities. And the reason I raise it is that, Nick's response to statins wasn't so great. A 30% response to rosuvastatin 20 milligrams isn't really the norm. It's a little less than you would expect. Now, that could just be Nick's physiology. That could be some other process that's affecting LDL receptors. Just a thought. Or maybe it's just the fact, no, you just can't keep up. Your receptors are trying as best they can, but we have now overwhelmed them. There are so many particles being produced that the production axis is actually driving the LDL, and it's less about the receptor, more about the production. So all of those things are elements that we have yet to figure out.
You're explaining a crucial component to the lipid energy model, that there's actually a net increase of triglycerides leaving the liver on purpose. That there's a higher recirculation, which can explain why there's more of the VLDL that carries it, and alongside, coupled with the faster turnover, resulting in the higher low-density lipoproteins and therefore the higher LDL cholesterol. The higher triglyceride export, again, we only typically see in populations that tend to have a greater level of illness because they have more de novo lipogenesis. Their livers are overproducing. Whereas in this case, we're positing that there's more recirculating of existing fatty acids to power somebody who is not only metabolically healthy, but is typically leaner and might have a reason to be exporting them at a faster and faster rate. And that's what we think is happening with Nick. That's what we think is happening with many of us who have the triad, such that when we do something like what Nick is doing, or something like I was doing, we actually see this pronounced change that quickly.